Good evening, and welcome to the first in this fall's series of Artisan Artists lectures. I'd like to begin by welcoming Philip Van, who is DIA's new director. As I'm sure you all know, this is his first day at work, and we're enormously happy to have him. I'd also like to thank Art for Art's Sake, our very stalwart anonymous donors who make this program possible, who have stood behind it for years and have really been wonderful patrons. I'd also like to thank the staff, and in particular Kristen Poor and Patrick Heilman, who make all the arrangements and all the technical and logistical things happen which are necessary to the smooth running of it, and particularly to thank Patrick for this new curtain, which we hope will do wonders for the audio issues. And then it's a great pleasure to welcome Robert Buck, who is known to many of you, I think, and who as recently as this summer, had a wonderful one-person show here on the floors, one of the floors below at CRG, where he has shown for many years. Bob was born in Baltimore in 1959 and gained his BA from the undergraduate film and television school, the Tisch School of the Arts, and then was on the Whitney program. He's been showing widely since 1996 and has several upcoming shows, including a show at Gallery Roloff Johnson in Brussels this November, and then in the spring at Anthony Meyer Fine Arts in San Francisco. Please join me in welcoming Robert Buck.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you for coming this evening. It's good to see you all. I'd like to begin by thanking Lynn for her encouragement and for the opportunity to share with you two of my abiding pursuits. I'm also grateful to Kristen Poor for her assistance and to Patrick Heilman for his technical support. My research would have been considerably diminished without the help of Joshua Fields, and I also want to thank Todd Alden for sharing with me his extensive Warhol library. Warhol. Warhola. What if we take Warhol as his word? To consider his acts of writing as a visible means by which to index his visual art. My impression is that Warhol's encounter with language was traumatic, and that it is this that underwrites his art. And with reference to the teachings of Jacques Lacan, notably his interpretation of the writings of James Joyce, I want to insinuate that Warhol was psychotic, an ordinary psychotic, who, for this reason, characterizes our time. It was a voice that guided me. The litter. This phrase, cited by Lacan from Finnegan's Wake, with its many connotations, refuse, offspring, straw bedding, a gurney, an absorbent granulated clay for cats, a correspondence, kept repeating itself to me, aware as I was of the voluminous writing devoted to Andy Warhol. From Lacan, what is a whole if nothing surrounds it? I heard it again as I considered Warhol's own writing in all 18 volumes, usually co-authored, including illustrated books and novels and Interview magazine. Before proceeding, given the complexity of these two titans, I want to offer anyone unfamiliar with Lacan's work two key concepts. First, Lacan's founding thesis is that the unconscious is structured like a language. It is composed of differential elements, signifiers and signifieds, and abides by the laws of metaphor and metonymy. Second, Lacan defined three structural orders or realms: the imaginary, the symbolic, and the real. This is illustrated by the Borromean knot, which employs as a topology a non-metaphorical way to explore the symbolic and its interactions with the other two realms. Later, after his encounter with James Joyce, the writings of James Joyce, he will add a fourth ring, which he calls the synthome. Warhol. If you want to know all about Andy Warhol, just look at the surface of my paintings and films and me, and there I am. There's nothing behind it. Lacan. The signifier represents a subject for another signifier. Oh, by the way, please note the small objet A, the little a, in the middle of the three rings. The folly to willfully mistake the letter A, purloined by chance, as we all know, from Andy Warhol's surname, for the French autre, or other, as an excuse to consider his writing in light of this object, little a, considered Lacan's greatest invention, proved to be exceptionally rewarding. In Lacanian algebra, there are two letter A's. The lowercase a, our topic here, and the larger uppercase A, or big other. I do have a script this evening, but unlike some vice presidential candidates, I will diverge from this script as we progress. It was the A, common to both Warhol and Lacan, that beckoned me. Objet petit a is purposefully defined reflexively as an elusive and abstract element. Attempts to summarize it can falter. The following synopsis, which is an amalgam of explanations found within the writings devoted to Lacan, is no exception. Object little a, or other, is something that drops away as a result of the subject's alienation in language. The human being is taken in by language, and object A is the result, the remainder. As a whole, a residual place within the chain, it becomes the cause of the structure and constitutes the subject, and with it, desire. As a kind of signifier in absentia, it is the lost object, albeit one that was never there to begin with, but is retroactively installed as having had to have been lost so as to veil the whole. It is an evanescent, positive waste that accommodates itself to the lack in the other. Other, please understand, also refers to the signifying chain, for others forge us into language. It is here, around objet A, that an unbearable traumatic excess of enjoyment, the French jouissance, is consolidated. It is a bit of the symbolic that gets stranded in the real. Objet A is a thing, an organ, and must be separable from the body, and it must have a relation to lack, i.e., breast, feces, penis. It embodies Lacan's definition of the subject as want to be, that is, being as lacking and being as desiring. He links it with semblance, asserting that it is a semblance of being. Under objet A are grouped the partial drives, which organize around the part objects, which I mentioned above, which Freud designated as breast, feces, penis. Lacan adds to these gaze and voice. These last two pertain to Warhol specifically. Pardon me. A as an Alphabet is Warhol's first illustrated book, and the first time the excised vowel makes a reappearance. In his seminar on Edgar Allan Poe's The Purloined Letter, Lacan traces the itinerary of another letter, a correspondence that stands in for objet A. Quote, "The purloined letter is synonymous with the original radical subject of the unconscious. The symbol is displaced in its pure state. One cannot come into contact with it without being caught in its play. When the characters get hold of this letter, something gets hold of them and carries them along. At each stage of the symbolic transformation of the letter, they will be defined by their position in relation to this radical object. For each of them, the letter is the unconscious, with all of its consequences, namely that at each point of the symbolic circuit, each of them becomes the other." Here is Warhol about the A. Quote, "Well, the reason why I dropped the A is that because when I was going around with a portfolio, it just happened by itself." And Ivan Karp responds, "Yeah, people just forgot to put it on, right?" Warhol, "Yeah, so it just happened. There were other Warhols in the telephone book, and, well, and he trails off. And from the book that you're looking at, quote, "By 1953, Warhol had changed his name from Warhola and had discontinued any affected variant of André Warhola, though he acquired several nicknames, including Raggedy Andy, because of his calculated appearance, and Andy Paperbag, because of his practice of carrying a paper bag instead of a portfolio. He later considered changing his name again to John Doe or Morning Star, according to Jackie Curtis and Ultraviolet, respectively. It is significant that André, although donned to affect sophistication and signed as if in French, was the correct Carpatho-Russian pronunciation, which is to say Slavic pronunciation, of his father's name, Ondrej, O-N-D-R-E-J. Andrew in English. Warhol, of course, drops this nomination, choosing instead, significantly, one made by mistake to his Russian name by an American art director, a woman, and other. This, his ultimate answer to Joyce's question, "How am I to sign myself?" is so tellingly counterpoised with his mother's mangling of the English language. We know the name games did not stop once the A was littered. For, as is well known, his mother, Julia, would often sign his name to illustrations. If she was too tired, Nathan Gluck would. Nathan Gluck, Warhol's assistant at the time, would do so. And according to Joseph Giordano, an advertising director and friend to both Julia and Andy, on occasion Julia would even claim herself to be Andy Warhol. Quote, "So she came in and she slammed the suitcase on the ground and she turned around. She looked at him and she said, 'I'm Andy Warhol.' And there was a big discussion about why she was Andy Warhol. But I guess she convinced him that he was." This is the quote. So you see, I can only work from Missy's influence on Andy, really, because I've only seen him in circumstances with Missy, really. Of course, lack is not a lack until it is marked as such. And it may never have accrued to Warhol in the guise of surface and void if he had not provided a space for it. By setting free the A in the real, as it were, Warhol betrays it as a master signifier, one that coordinates a place for all the rest. In effect, he announces it as, quote, a signifier charged with jouissance that cannot be integrated into the signifying chain. Yet, what Warhol cuts, in turn, cuts him. A for augmentation, sanded nose, skin creams, pinhole glasses, girdles, wigs. The letter A amounts to a unifying trait. Warhol, rather than Lacan, might have well famously said, man's desire is the desire of the other. This recalls the apocryphal anecdote in which Warhol, formerly Varchola, shows two painted renditions of a Coca-Cola bottle to Emilio D'Antonio in the early 60s to ask which, dirty or clean, he prefers. The letter A is the first letter in both the 26-letter English alphabet and the 36-letter Russian Cyrillic alphabet, the only letter of the 12 common to both that coincides in placement. Russian is an East Slavic language with 6 dialects, including Lemko, which the Warholists spoke at home in Pittsburgh. Russian shares a linguistic ancestry with Russian, Belarusian, Ukrainian. From the book you're looking at, Julia Warhola never was Americanized. She remained loyal to her Czech roots all her life. She spoke Czech in the home and taught it to her sons. Just to clarify, in most of the Warhol literature, Carpatho-Russian, that language, that Slavic language, is referred to with the umbrella term Czech, but there is a difference. The older boys, Paul and John, tried to speak it on occasion to please her, but Andy rejected it. And if she ever spoke to him in her native tongue, he answered in English. This was the earliest evidence of Andy's commitment to all things American. But when John and Paul were small, very little was spoken around them but Czech. Their efforts to speak it left them with funny accents, quote unquote, causing other children to mock them. From Wayne Kostenbaum. Warhol distrusted language. He didn't understand how grammar unfolded episodically in linear time rather than in one violent atemporal explosion. During his first year at Carnegie Tech, Warhol flunked out because of his traumatic relationship with the written word. The adult Andy Warhol became a prolific author and memorable aphorist. These successes have obscured the fact that he could not write. The inability went further than mere dependence on ghostwriters would suggest. He avoided ever writing anything down. I found virtually no correspondence in his hand. Clearly, he was dyslexic, though undiagnosed. Some of his errors: video for video, Polorod and Polairod for Polaroid, Tailland for Thailand, script for script, Pastic for plastic, Herion for heroin, and Leroy for Leroy. He had a hard time with simple English, unquote. Warhol's relationship to language was disturbed, and so his work is riddled with it. Caption, copy, label, headline, brand, instruction, writing, recording. The list goes on. The psychotic speaks as if language were coming not from inside, but from outside. Lacan's writing on psychosis provides the most developed articulation of the relationship between subject and voice. The name of the Father, hyphenated term, is a cornerstone of Lacan's teaching. He interprets the Oedipus complex in terms of metaphor because it involves the crucial concept of substitution. In this case, the substitution of the name of the Father and everything that it connotes, the law, name, language, etc. In this case, the substitution of the name of the Father for the desire of the Mother. It is the preeminent metaphor and guarantees the possibility of all other metaphors. It enacts Oedipal prohibition and is therefore designated as the paternal function. As the fundamental signifier, it permits signification to proceed normally. It confers identity on the subject, naming and positioning him or her within the symbolic order. However, if this metaphor is foreclosed, like a non-admissible piece of evidence within a court of law, it causes a hole in the symbolic order and imprisons the subject in the imaginary realm, which prevails in psychosis. The connection between signifier and signified is tenuous and can lead to a radical separation of the two chains unless they are bound at anchoring points. A number of these knots are essential for a subject to achieve normalcy. When they are absent or come untied, psychosis results. The psychotic's experience is then plagued by the constant metonymic slippage of the signified beneath the signifiers, a disaster for signification. Thus, the phenomenon most apparent in psychoses are disturbances of language. For instance, holophrases, a string of adjoining words, portmanteaus, one word for two, and neologisms, existing words redefined or new words altogether. In all, metonymy prevails. With signifier and signified unmoored, the signifier itself becomes the object of communication. Hence, signification will be distributed between code phenomenon, or language, and message phenomenon, meaning. Foreclosed, it's foreclosed to me, where'd it go? Foreclosed, a signifier can horrifyingly reappear where it should not, outside within the real. There it produces moments in which objects are transformed by an ineffable strangeness. They are revealed as shocks, enigmas, and significations. The psychotic believes these hallucinatory or apparitional significations, also known as elementary phenomenon, with near fanatical conviction. Part of the psychoses is that when this signifier in the real confronts them, it's a near mystical experience. The part of it is the certainty of signification. They are sure, above all else, that it signifies, and it signifies something quite important. Warhol's father, mostly absent from the home according to the philosophy, died when Warhol was not quite 13. As the story goes, Warhol, unable to bear the sight of the dead father, laid out in the living room, a Greek Catholic tradition, hid beneath his bed until his father's body was removed. My research turned up only one photograph of Warhol's father, which is saying something considering the literature devoted to Andy Warhol. And this was in the Victor Braucus biography, which you see. And even here, the caption does not readily identify him as one of the three men pictured. There's actually a fourth man here. Radio became popular after being used in World War I for communication purposes. The first commercial radio station in the United States, KDKA, was established in 1920 in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. By 1922, the first regular entertainment programs and advertisements were broadcast. Radio proliferated, evolving into what is commonly referred to as the Golden Age of radio, dating from 1935 to 1950. Coca-Cola, Campbell's Soup, Jell-O, and Kellogg's were among the most prominent advertisers of the era. Andy Warhol was born in 1928. The bouts of St. Vitus dance that he refers to as his nervous breakdowns occurred when he was 8, 9, and 10 years old. What you see here is just a page from an anthology of different comics from that era. Two of the radio programs were also comic books: Dick Tracy, which was on the air for a decade beginning in 1938, and Popeye the Sailor, which ran from 1935 to 1938. Another program was a pulp magazine, The Shadow. Originally the Detective Story Hour, it was renamed due to the popularity of its mysterious narrator. From 1937 to 1935, The Shadow had, quote, the power to cloud men's minds. And just to give you an idea of what that might have sounded like on radio,
The shadows.
Again, these are just some of the dime pulp magazines of the era. And on December 9th, 1938, at the end of the 18th show of the Mercury Theater of the Air, Orson Welles announced the show's new sponsor, the Campbell's Soup Company. The series moved from Sunday to Friday, and the name was changed to the Campbell Playhouse. It was on the air through 1946. Most stories were based on classic books, but popular movies were also adapted.
Not very often. Today, of all the soups in the world, tomato soup is the one most often served. Not because women have taken to making tomato soup frequently. No, on the contrary, few housewives ever attempt it anymore. There's just one reason for tomato soup's popularity, and it is this: the magic, matchless flavor of Campbell's tomato soup. There's a lively burst of dashing zest about this flavor that people take to at once and come back to and enjoy again and again. The first rinsy taste of it has a way of arousing a desire to eat, and yet there's a pleasant feeling of satisfaction when the last spoonful is gone. So this soup is a happy choice for the main dish at lunchtime or at supper, and it also is a fine way to start the day's main meal. Serve it sometimes too as cream of tomatoes, made with milk instead of water. You can always be sure that it will be received with pleasure, because this, of all soups, is the one people like to have most often: Campbell's tomato soup.
Another popular radio figure of the day was Charlie McCarthy. Edgar Bergen and his dummy were on the air from 1937 to July 1956. Can the ironic popularity of a ventriloquist on the radio where the trick of throwing the voice goes unseen be explained as a phenomenon of the fascination for the new medium itself? It's as if the dummy were there to embody the disembodied voice of radio, to give form to what would otherwise be an auditory hallucination. In Warhol's recollection, his Charlie McCarthy doll is by his side summers as he recuperates from his so-called breakdowns. Interrupting the Carpathio-Rusyn spoke in the Warhol home was the English voice of American commercial radio. Although speech behaves differently from language, voice, which buoys it, does not. The voice is precisely that which cannot be said. The voice inhabits, haunts language. And although speech knots signifier to signified, a third term is needed, namely, voice. The voice is everything in the signifier that does not partake in the effect of signification. What Lacan calls voice is akin to intonation, and its modalities. He implies that the signifying chain is not only spoken and heard, but written and read. Or let me say, because it is spoken and heard, it is written and read. The voice appears in its dimension of object when it is the other's voice. In this respect, the voice is the part of the signifying chain that the subject cannot assume as I or ego, and which is subjectively assigned to the other. The voice comes in place of what is probably unspeakable about the subject, what Lacan called the subject's surplus enjoyment or jouissance, also known as little object A. Again, Wayne Kostenbaum. Words troubled Andy Warhol, and although he wrote, with ghostly assistance, many books, and had a speaking style that everyone can recognize because it has become the voice of the United States, halting, empty, breathy, like Jackie's or Marilyn's, whose silent faces sealed his fame. Tina Fredericks describes meeting Warhol thus. He had a breathy way of talking. His voice was slight, unemphatic, whispery, covered over with a smile. When you read his writings, you can almost hear him speaking in that voice. The philosophy of Andy Warhol, from A to B and back again. Here, the excised A makes its reappearance so forcefully as to reduce Warhol to the letter itself. I quote, "I wake up and I call B. B is anybody who helps me kill time. B is anybody and I am nobody. B and I." Unquote. And from the Love Puberty chapter, I had 3 nervous breakdowns when I was a child, spaced a year apart. The attacks, St. Vitus dance, always started on the first day of summer vacation. I don't know what this meant. I would spend all summer listening to the radio and lying in bed with my Charlie McCarthy doll and my cut out paper dolls all over the spread and under the pillow. My father was away a lot on business trips to the coal mines, so I never saw him very much. My mother would read to me in her thick Czechoslovakian accent as best she could, and I would always say, quote, "Thanks, Mom," unquote, after she finished with Dick Tracy, even if I hadn't understood a word. She'd give me a Hershey bar every time I finished a page in my coloring book. Unquote. If meaning was suspended or delayed due to the indeterminacy of English by way of Carpatho-Russin, something else became the communicative mortar between mother and son, which this passage from the philosophy quietly suggests. This anchor is the newly emergent voice of commercial radio, which broadcasts American popular culture of the 1930s to the home. Warhol, in his recounting the anecdote 40 years later, in From A to B, ciphers an attempt to establish a borderline by first responding to Julia's thick Slavic accent in English with, "Thanks, Mom," the only bit of quoted dialogue in the chapter, which ripples with the corresponding "but no thanks." This boundary is fortified with the signifier Hershey bar. Deciphered to the letter, as Lacan recommends, her, she's, barred. As far as I know, with the exception of T-shirts in 1979, the Hershey bar never achieved iconographic status in Warhol's work, surprisingly, or not so surprisingly as the case may be. And I leave to you the arrayed interpretations of Dick Tracy. To quote again Lacan, "The signifier is posited only insofar as it has no relation to the signified." Later in the same chapter, "But I didn't get married until 1974 when I got my first tape recorder. My wife. My tape recorder and I have been married for 10 years now. When I say we, I mean my tape recorder and me. A lot of people don't understand that. The acquisition of my tape recorder really finished whatever emotional life I might have had, but I was glad to see it go." Unquote. Warhol does not mention what others do. He had purchased a tape recorder previously for Julia sometime in the mid-1950s. She uses it to record herself singing Russian folk songs, and then in playback, she sings along with herself. Julia, too, apparently, from A to B and back again. This, too, a not insignificant detail from her biography, for the effect it must have lent to Warhol's illness, was the death of her first child, Justina, before she immigrated to America in 1921, following her husband by about 9 years. As it pertains to the mother-son, A to B and back again, 2 more examples. From Holy Cats by Andy Warhol's mother, quote, "Some pussies up there love her, some don't. Some like it day, some like it night. Some talk to angels, some talk to themselves. Some know they are pussy cats, so they don't talk at all. Some play with angels, some play with boys, some play with themselves. Some don't play with nobody." Unquote. And from John Hallowell's 1965 book, The Truth Game, this is Andy speaking. It would have been a giveaway. "Favorite tie, favorite pickle, favorite ring, favorite Dixie cup, favorite ice cream, favorite hippie, favorite record, favorite song, favorite movie, favorite Indian, favorite penny, favorite feet, favorite fish, favorite saint, favorite sin, favorite beetle." Unable to progress to metaphor, the untriggered psychotic idles somewhere between the first and second signifiers of the chain, somewhere along the way from A to be. Technically speaking, somewhere between alienation and separation. Quote, "This malfunction initiates an intransitive. It means, it wants to say, an unaccomplished signification, an enigmatic emptiness, a degree zero of signification, which soon becomes, it means it wants to say something. The signification of signification itself. The subject knows that what is said concerns him, but there is some signification. The subject knows that what is said concerns him, that there is some signification, although he does not know which one." And I mention this because I'm trying to illustrate the difficulty of Carpatho-Rusyn and English, and the older brothers speak the Slavic dialect, and the parents do, but the youngest son doesn't. And as we know from so many accounts, when Warhol was putting on the exploding plastic inevitable, he and his mother would communicate by her speaking in Rusyn and Warhol responding in English. So he well knew the language. Although Lacan introduced the mirror stage in 1936, the concept evolved throughout his career. In the early 60s, he makes a critical revision when he stresses the role played by the other and the voice, exemplified by the mother's speech, and highlights the conflictual nature of the dual relationship it establishes. By the early 1950s, he had no longer viewed the mirror stage simply as a formative stage of ego identification and self-consciousness, a product of a child's jubilant but false assumption of its reflected illusory image as self. Rather, he deems it a permanent and integral structure of subjectivity, a paradigm of the imaginary order. By the 1960s, he can say things like, "The plane of the mirror is governed by the voice of the other," and that the gaze is indexed by the voice. Or, "The gaze is the underside of consciousness." In short, it is the voice that bisects the plane of the mirror and animates the specular realm. Revisiting the mirror stage, Lacan synthesizes both voice and gaze as objet A. Gaze is not understood as sight. And this is just a general statement. Don't understand gaze as sight or confuse it with sight, but as the place from which others see you, which is everywhere. As Lacan ominously puts it, the most the subject can expect is to appear within the gaze as a stain. I want to digress for a moment to illustrate the mortifying power of the gaze when it does appear. Andy Warhol and Jamie Wyeth agreed to paint portraits of one another in 1976, which, to my knowledge, is an anomalous situation in Warhol's career. In their responses, the stakes of the gambit can be heard. Andy: "Jamie was a very difficult subject. I don't know why. I took more pictures of him than anyone else. It took 2 months of thinking about." Jamie: "I just felt a rapport. I knew it was something I wanted the minute the idea came up. I see this portrait of Andy as a sort of portrait of New York. I love New York, and I feel this is New York." Andy: I wasn't concerned about how he would paint me. I think it's great. It's so realistic, I can't believe it. Warhol's response here recalls a Lacan maxim, the unconscious is outside. And also from Lacan about this reflective portrait project. Quote, "When in love, I solicit a look. What is profoundly unsatisfying and always missing is that you never look at me from the place from which I see you. Conversely, what I look at is never what I wish to see." If the comparison of the two portraits is compelling, it may be due to how graphically apparent Warhol's desire is to tame the gaze, a camouflaging that Lacan calls "don't regard." Literally, a taming of the gaze, to lay the gaze down. To cleave Warhol closer to Lacan's Joyce, specifically the epiphanies, as symptomatic of psychosis and enigmatic experiences, I refer to the following excerpts. As you listen, so as to better appreciate the uncanny similarities, exchange Joyce's name for Warhol's. Jean-Louis Gault describes the epiphanies as follows. I will say in advance, the epiphanies were excerpts that Joyce found that he inserted into his stories or into his writing. Quote, Joyce described the process of his literary creation. He collects words from shops and posters, from the crowd that walks past him. He repeats them to himself over and over and over, so that in the end they lose their signification for him. These words, read, heard, present themselves in the dimension of the elementary phenomenon, detached from any signification. The word becomes the thing that it is. Joyce raises the mutation of the letter into the litter to the dignity of an epiphany. And as I say, these are snippets of speech that you will see turn up in stories and writings of James Joyce. And I pause, or I'm hesitant, because it's usually most commonly, more frequently found in the stories collected in the Dubliners. Lacan defines the epiphany as a direct nodding of the unconscious to the real and says, the formidable creative power of Joyce stems from the fact that he is not only held back by any connections that the letter has with the symbolic and the imaginary. He is in relation with a letter that has severed all of its identifications, which is not attached to any stable signification. Unquote. Catherine Milot notes, quote, the epiphany marks an uncanny coincidence of insignificance and signifying tautology, at once the evacuation and the overdetermination of meaning. And Philippe Dravers, for the definition of the epiphany does not simply lie at the level of an isolated experience, but also in the very act of writing it down. And it is this act that ultimately allows Joyce to reassert a relation to the other without passing via fantasy in the normal neurotic way. In fact, in the epiphany, Joyce succeeds in nodding speech, the symbolic, directly to the letter, the real, thereby reducing his experience to the reality of the knot in a rigorous act which, through its dual aspects of transcription and transmission, founds the certainty of his aesthetic mission. Lacan's work with Joyce culminates in the mid-1970s with Seminar 23, the synthome. Synthome is a Joyce neologism that sings, sin, home, saint, Tom, synthetic, and so on. This seminar, I'm quoting from Thomas Slovas, this seminar explores what we could call the enigma of Joyce. Lacan's Joyce is a psychotic subject, but one who never has the symptoms of a full-blown psychosis. The issue of stabilization then becomes paramount. How does Joyce achieve this? Lacan returns to his old notion of imaginary compensation to describe how Joyce's ego, as a writer, allowed him to make a name for himself and compensate for the foreclosure of the name of the father. He argues that foreclosure is represented by a break in the three-ringed Borromean knot of imaginary, symbolic, and real, a failure of knotting, but one which can be compensated for by a fourth ring. In Joyce's case, the ego and his writing, which, like the earlier concept of imaginary compensation, the ego is, of course, imaginary, will allow the structure to hold together without falling apart. Lacan now rewrites psychic structure as a four-ringed knot, in which it is the synthome as fourth ring that holds the other three together. Furthermore, the synthome is nothing more than a universal form of what used to be the name of the father, which Lacan says was basically Freud's way of locking together the three rings. So furthermore, the synthome is nothing more than a universal form of what used to be known as the name of the father, now, but is now one possible synthome or fourth ring. Consequently, Joyce is no longer the exception. Joyce's psychosis is rather an ordinary one that perhaps resembles neuroses. In hindsight, Warhol's fetish for naming and name-dropping is the uncanny symptom of the all-sizzle, no-stake age of advertising, and the rise, in the wake of World War II, of consumer culture. The evolution of the commodified, now liquidated signifier, no longer carried aloft by a voice, but broadcast as an image, is announced by the soup cans. The contiguous serial canvases, labels change, cans do not, slide metonymically, culminating in their true signification of showing just how ruthlessly the signifier stuffs the signified, like a turkey, Lacan says. A to B, but always back again. Forecasting what Rainer Krohn called Warhol's panel paintings, the cans, taken together, are redolent of icon screens, the wall that separates the sanctuary from the nave in the Greek Catholic Church. Formerly akin to comic books, the sequential frames of the pictorial grids infer narrative and reciprocally reading, yet perilously free of captions or thought bubbles, they risk slipping their connotative moorings. The influence on Warhol of the formal aspect of the iconostasis is well known, but a secondary aspect, call it the interpretive injunction, exerted an equal force. Perhaps Warhol could not write, but he could read. Can his paintings be construed as active writings? Are they more critically appreciated as transcriptions, an A to a B? His means progressing technically from blotted line to stamp, to opaque projector, to silkscreen? Warhol is writer, the tape recorder, the books, and the quote-unquote voice portraits of Interview magazine. And arguably, the films and videos bespeak this possibility. Like Joyce's epiphanies, his paintings reappear from the outer space of American popular culture. Apparitions, neither photograph nor painting, cultural litter, visual neologism, we encounter them as an indefinite article, codes in search of a message. A to a B and back again. The images stammer, echo, stutter, falter, pile up, with no means of crossing the bar to metaphor. Instead, as a consequence of code divorced of meaning, signification stalls, and the lifeblood of the images congealed before our eyes, transmogrified as icon. It's as if each pass of the squeegee struggles to find the proper tone or modulation, the right pitch or inflection, as if speech were in search of a voice, or as if we had a sudden vision of the surface of language. Doesn't repetition cycle the failure of a signifier to properly signify and simultaneously the registration of the troubled, excessive enjoyment it occasions? Anticipating the late work, specifically the camouflage paintings, do they quiet the language disturbances indexed by the earlier paintings? For the repetitive aspect of the imagery is intrinsic to the vernacular form. The silkscreen grid is hidden within the mimicry pattern of the fabric print. So in other words, what's camouflaged is the process that we know only too well from Warhol's earlier output. Put differently, did speech finally find a voice? To recapitulate, there are three critical ways in which Warhol may have been missed. He was not Czech, but Carpatho-Rusin, a nationality with a different language and cultural heritage. I should also say dialect. The influence of commodity culture on his art is more accurately cited in the golden age of radio rather than 1950s advertising culture exclusively. And finally, his relationship to the gaze is inflected by the voice object. Perhaps Citizen Warhol's rosebud, the purloined letter A, the supplement, can be apprehended finally as the name of the father, André, his namesake, his ab-sense, synthome. With his ordinary psychosis, Warhol announces the age of the father's twilight, the shift from the ideal to the objet A as the organizing point of identification, the rise of the discourse of the capitalist, and the shift from the discourse of the master to the discourse of the university and bureaucracies as the key organizing discourses today. Warhol is the son that Freud's dead and thus valorized fathers, Oedipus, and the father of the primal horde, precipitate. In the name of the Father and of the Son. Warhol may have offered us a peek at what has been called the valorization of enjoyment, part of a wider process of distillation in which surplus enjoyment is converted into pure value, like labor before it. I quote from the essay, "When Surplus Enjoyment Meets Surplus Value" by Alenka Zupanchik. Quote, "The total is increasing, and this is called accumulation of capital. What makes this accumulation possible is that the surplus enjoyment starts to be counted. What is being exploited and squeezed in every imaginable way is now precisely our enjoyment as an immediate source of surplus value." Lastly, I liken Warhol's legacy to one of Lacan's many riddles for the real and the symptom, that which does not stop not being written. And so it falls to us to continue to read and to write. Thank you.
Other questions?
Yes?
Where did you get those radio recordings?
On the internet. And I have to say, considering the titanic proportions of this endeavor, I had a very short window of time to do the research. So I imagine that more can be found. I have to say, speaking of enjoyment, this was one of the most pleasurable things to do. It was overwhelming and almost too daunting, but I love them both so much that I really wanted to respect what they've given me, and I hope that I've been able to do that. Which is also to say, it really deserves, I feel that it could be embellished.
But for the moment, I think you've left us speechless.
Oh, thank you. Thank you.